It's 5 a.m. in New York, 10 a.m. in London, 6 p.m. here in Singapore, and 9 p.m. in Sydney. Welcome to our live webcast on the Global Food Security Index 2019. I'm Mark Lowdy, delighted to have you with us for the next hour. We're going to be talking about the just released Global Food Security Index developed by the Economist Intelligence Unit and supported by Corteva Agriscience. And in a few moments, I'll tell you how you can take part. But first, allow me to introduce our guests who will be here to tell you a bit more about the index and also answer your questions. Immediately to my right is Sumana Rajaratnam, who is the Director of Public Policy at the EIU. You've been in the job for almost 10 years and tends to cater for United Nations projects. So he's very strong on this particular subject. He'll be taking us through the Global Food Security Index shortly. Next to him is Farah Siriga, who's the ASEAN Managing Director of Corteva Agriscience. Has been with DuPont unit since 2003, spent time all around this region and joins us to reflect on the agricultural production aspect of the index. And we're also very pleased to have with us Lim Chuan Po, who is the chairman of the Singapore Food Agency. He is the immediate past chairman of the government's Agency for Science, Technology and Research. And also you have a military career behind you, most recently as Chief of Defence. Thank you very much for joining us. He'll be giving us the local Asian but also a Singaporean view on the index, and you'll see why Singapore is important in just a few moments. And rounding out our discussion is Ming Tan, who is a celebrity chef, guest starred on the MasterChef here in Singapore in 2018, and is also a producer of food-related programs. So welcome to you all. Now, let me tell you a bit more about how you can get involved in the discussion. It's very simple. Go to the comments box underneath this video and pose your question at any time, or perhaps you are in the food business and you have a contribution to make or a comment to make. Please also do that in the comments box nearby, and we will do our best to get to your questions or comments as soon as we possibly can. Now, the Global Food Security Index just launched has once again put Singapore on top of that list. But when you look through the index, there are quite a number of very important signs that we will look through. The first is that 1 in 9 people around the world go hungry. That doesn't sound like much as a fraction, but when you consider that that equates to 820 million people, you see just how big an issue this is. And even among those countries that are doing very well, 1/3 of the countries in the index have 1 in 10 of their populations not receiving the nutrition that they need. So in the next hour, we will be covering the availability of food. We'll be talking about the nutritional aspects, and we will round out our conversation on climate change and the impact that the changing climate has on food security. Right, Sumana, let's start first in terms of the overview of the Global Food Security Index and what's the latest for 2019.
Look, it's a very important topic, and the number that you picked up on, 820 million people around the world that don't have proper access to food. One of the big things that the Food Security Index looks at is what countries can do in order to get that number smaller. Now, one of the Sustainable Development Goals is food security. And as we designed this index, which is essentially a common framework for countries to use to look at how they can approach food security, one thing that we had in mind was that next year it's 10 years to 2030. And so, there's added momentum and added pressure to look at how we can solve some of these problems. Food security is a multifaceted issue that, very complex, looks at different systems. You can look at things like the environment that we're going to talk about. You can look at things like culture that we've talked about as well. You can look at things like your location. Mm-hmm. But what the Global Food Security Index has for us, now that we've done it for 8 years, is a common way of looking at this across 113 countries, a way that we compare these different countries so that we can find strengths and weaknesses, we can find areas for improvements. Now that we've done it for 8 years, we can also find different trends that we can pick up. Mm-hmm. What is the Food Security Index used for? Governments primarily use it as a policy benchmark to see how their countries are doing across various important factors. Multilateral institutions such as the UN and the FAO use it as a way to advocate and to look at how different policies have progressed. And definitely there are groups that also look at the Food Security Index and use it to adjust their investment priorities.
Right, and in fact you can click on foodsecurityindex.eiu.com. The link is in the description of this video, and explore it for yourself. In fact, maybe you'd like to do so now to see what you can discover and join our conversation, contribute through questions or comments. So what were the key findings?
Key findings. Well, first I would say please go onto the website and click it. There's a wealth of data there, but it also gives you the opportunity to pick and choose which factors you think are most important, and then see how the index changes. So a very nice and dynamic website. Now first, just very quickly, what does the index measure? It measures three things in general. We have three categories. One is affordability, it's the cost of food. We look at things like agricultural tariffs. And then we have another category called availability. So how easy it is to import the food into your country, how much food do you produce, what does your agricultural infrastructure look like, how good is that? And then the third category, which is very important, is the quality and safety of that food. How nutritious is it? How diverse is your diet? Are you getting the right types of protein, things like that? So those are the three main categories, and that's where we come up with the rankings. Go through the rankings, although you gave away top spot just now. The other category that we looked at is extremely interesting, and I think we should talk about later, is climate and natural resources, because of course that has a big impact on your own food security. Now, top level findings, the rankings are there for all to see, but Singapore and Ireland finish in the top and second position, as they did last year, followed by the US and Switzerland. Countries like Kuwait and Qatar are the most improved in the index for reasons that I'll talk about just a little bit later. And the ones that have big conflicts like Venezuela and Yemen finish at the bottom, and that's no surprise there. But instead of focusing on rankings, I thought a good way to seg into our conversation is to look at some of the trends that we are seeing. One is that a positive trend, we're seeing more investment in agricultural infrastructure throughout these countries. So countries are investing in things like innovation in their logistics, so being able to transport food more efficiently, both at the high end. So countries like Australia are innovating in the use of blockchain and digital technology to do that, but also quite innovative with small solution like off-grid solar refrigeration systems in order to make sure that your agricultural infrastructure is good. One of the more negative trends that we are seeing is that nutritional monitoring has decreased. So when you're looking at things like protein quality and the availability of nutrients, it is important for you to monitor your population through the use of surveys and other sorts of qualitative tools like that in order to set your policies. And what we've found from last year to this year is that as we've applied a higher standard to the nutritional guidelines and regulatory framework in the country, less countries have a strict way of looking and monitoring nutritional standards at the national level. So I'll leave you with those two trends.
Yes. Well, and there's so much to talk to. I hope you'll join our conversation shortly. Lim Chuan Po, as the chairman of the Singapore Food Agency, I'm not sure, should we congratulate you for being on top of the index for the second year running? How does a country as small as Singapore, with virtually no natural resources, including agriculture, manage to reach the top of the Global Food Security Index?
In many senses, Singapore is an interesting story because ever since we gained independence, we've been focused on building the capacity within the country. One big area, of course, is investing in education, but of course, there's a view that that has to eventually grow the economy, sustain steady growth for the economy, and making sure it's inclusive. Because nothing solves problem better than giving people the purchasing power to do the right thing for themselves. So we have been able to do that. And in fact, complementing that is that when you have a growing economy and good distribution of the benefits, you can be more targeted in helping the needy in society in terms of their access to quality food. So on the demand side, this is what Singapore really has done. Because of the smallness of Singapore, everything comes at a price. So we move away from producing our own food to make space for economic growth. And this is why we are now very food dependent. We import almost all our food. We produce less than 10%. So our primary strategy for food security in Singapore really is diversification of our import sources. We want to be sure that there's no critical food item that we're dependent on one single country or one single region, so that it is a robust enough strategy for Singapore. I think it has worked for Singapore up until now because of this very diversified approach. We are now importing from more locations than we ever did in the past. But we are also at the same time very mindful, especially in recent years, of the impact of climate change, extreme weather event, and how that eventually lead to supply shock. So this is something that we are paying a lot of attention, and we can develop this topic later on.
Yes, we certainly will in the next hour. Farah, at Corteva Agriscience, you support the index. What is it that you get out of it, and what are some of the things that really leapt out at you from it?
I think that the Global Food Security Index really helps to identify and areas where we can really work together, especially around public and private partnership. Not only at the farm level, which is what we do, enabling our farmers to produce more with less impact to the environment, but also actually at the advocacy level, right? What are the things that we can actually work together, private and public partnership, to be more open in terms of policy, so that, like you mentioned, the movement of food, logistic of food become more cost efficient, more transparent. So.
It strikes me, listening to you so far, that actually a lot of this is down to logistics.
Right.
I mean, availability isn't about whether it's grown, it's like in Singapore, can we get access to it? Does that mean that actually the world is producing enough food to feed those 10 billion mouths by 2050?
I think Sumana can actually help with that, but I believe increasingly, yes, there's opportunity, for that, and it's really more unlocking the access and making sure that there's openness to actually to share the resources.
Mm-hmm. Do you want to chime in?
Yes, it's a very complex issue. So, as you said, I think that we are producing enough food. The question is, how do we distribute that food?
Yes.
How much of it is lost? Food loss is a big issue in a lot of urban environments. And also, what type of food is it? So the quality of food that you're producing. So in terms of the caloric intake, we are producing enough. But in terms of the quality of that food, the diversity of nutrients that is produced, that's a very important issue.
Can I chime in here? Because
actually, Mr. Lim, I was actually going to pass over to Ming Tan, because as soon as he said the quality of the food, I could sense Ming wanting,
absolutely the right person.
wanting to leap in. Ming, come on in on this, because we haven't heard from you yet. Given what you've read in the Global Food Security Index so far, how much of a concern is this at the kitchen counter, as it were?
As chefs, we are the sort of final end stage before food and our food systems have a sort of immediate impact on consumers, right? We produce based on what we receive, and then we feed people with it. So obviously we're very into the aspect of what is it in your food that we are producing and giving to people. And Sumana's point on caloric content, the availability of the nutrition. Are we feeding people things like refined carbohydrates, sugars, palm oils with a lot of additives, right? These are all things that, as chefs, we are very concerned with. We look at, and having a little bit more information on that definitely helps us to make decisions, especially to the end stage consumer. Mm-hmm. We hear the feedback directly from people.
Right. So and what are they saying?
At this point now, I think you're seeing a lot of consumers be extremely mindful about the provenance of where their food comes from, and you've seen growth in trends like sourcing, right? The quality of the food in terms of nutritional content, but not all across the market. I think you see a certain type of consumer more into that sort of information. Others are maybe more concerned with straight value and the physical amounts of food you can obtain for a certain price.
Mm-hmm. Mr. Lim?
Yes, can I just come back to the point that Sumana raised? Because I listened to a presentation recently coming from the chief scientist of Manmade, Professor Mark Post, and he was showing the challenge with unsustainable diet, because of convergence of developing economy diet to the developed world's diet. And in fact, in that same presentation, he highlighted that we probably need at least 2 Earths to sustain the demand, not of the population per se, but this so-called increasing demand arising from the unsustainable diet. So because of this complex interaction, we may have some very significant challenges ahead.
Mm-hmm. And when you look at the quality, what is a company like Corteva Agriscience doing in order to improve it so that it isn't just empty calories?
Yeah, I think there's a couple of things that that we can do. I think at the farm level, there's a lot of improvement that we can actually make by educating our farmers how to not only grow more food but better quality food, right? So better quality vegetables, better quality produce, for example. So that actually helps, right, with the nutrition value, with the quality. There's also a way where we can actually map, agronomically map basically growing conditions versus variations of crops that can be grown in certain area, so that there's more varieties that people can actually grow, and that provides to the local community better access to multiple type of food, better nutritious. Mm-hmm. Another thing that we can actually work on is actually collaborating with food chain partners to actually really break that barriers between farmers to the market, so that we have more transparency and more direct access of farmers to the market, to the big buyers. And that will actually help to do 2 things: not only stabilize the prices of food, but also improve profitability of farmers. And that will actually help with the nutrition challenge, which is very often linked to poverty. And more than 75% of the world poor actually live in rural areas.
Yes,
so
ironically.
Ironically. So these are basically, so by making farmers more profitable, rural community more well off, we can also help them to actually be able to access more nutritious food. Yeah.
Let's pick up on the technology angle first. How would you characterize these farmers? Are they receptive to new ways of growing food and bringing technology in?
Yeah. It's a good question. I think here in Asia, 90% of our farmers are actually smallholder farmers. And they're actually also aging farmers. And they're increasingly challenged with climate change, labor constraint, water constraints, right? So I think the way that we need to approach them with is actually how they can see their farming as an enterprise, as their livelihood, and how by actually adopting this new technology, you're actually helping them not only to produce more better quality, but actually to be more profitable, for their own wellness.
Because if you raise prices, that's probably also not going to solve the situation of feeding people who are currently poor. Your report found about a quarter of people would fall below the poverty line of the middle income type countries. So how do you, on the one hand, increase the profitability of the farmer without necessarily increasing the price?
On Farah's point, one of the indicators that we collect in the index is access to financing for farmers. Extremely important. In fact, this indicator is very highly correlated with the overall result of the index. So if governments are able to make access to financing easy, that means that there's a high correlation to better food security. So that's a very important point that you mentioned, that the report goes into a bit more. The other thing, which is very, very complex, is that for a lot of smallholding farmers, and that applies in Asia Pacific especially, the main bulk of the finance that goes into production actually comes from the farmers themselves. And that is a data point that is very difficult to reach.
Okay, explain that a little. What does that mean?
So that means, farmers, when they are investing in their crop, when they are buying the seeds and things like that, they have some support from the government, and that's great. But the majority of their investment comes from themselves.
From previous years' takings,
exactly,
previous years' crops.
Right? So that makes it very difficult. That adds to volatility. That adds to sort of the fragility of the production process.
Mm-hmm. Okay, and then once again, it all ends up on the kitchen table, on the dining room table. Ming, have you noticed a big increase in anecdotally in terms of the food prices that correlate to what's said in the Global Food Security Index?
I think from my perspective, as a close to end-stage user of the product, there have definitely been changes that the entire industry has felt. You're talking about price increases for certain types of fish, as well as the non-availability of certain types of products. Well, talking about fish specifically, size decreases of certain species have been very, very obvious to us for various reasons. And these are some of the things that we see also. We can hear our suppliers tell us that, oh, there was this reason, there was inclement weather, there was a poor availability or a terrible season, or no one wants to grow it anymore, and then hence we don't find and obtain these ingredients anymore. So as chefs, we do get a very direct link to problems that affect food production, yes.
Will higher prices actually give you a better product?
Not necessarily so.
Really? That's quite remarkable, isn't it? And in Singapore, you'd be particularly concerned, considering how fussy eaters Singaporeans, but Asians generally are.
Yes.
I mean, even just a small increase will already turn them away. Is this something that people will have to get used to?
Yes. So I think diversification gives us the option of choosing a whole spectrum of food for a different price point because we're very focused on the nutritional value, and you don't have to go for the same ingredient to give it the nutrition. You want to be sure that there's a whole affordability range. We're obviously very aware of some sources that are less sustainable compared to other sources. I think Ming raised a great example of fish. Aquaculture is a fast-growing industry in Singapore. And because we don't have lots of water, we have to take quite different, fundamentally different approach for aquaculture. There's a lot more of the sustainability involved in how fish are reared in Singapore. We took closed containment system approach. You are more isolated from the environmental impact. And in fact, when you look at the global supply of fish, the farm fish has now overtaken, captured fish some years back, about 3-4 years back, in terms of constituting more than 50% of the supply. And I imagine that going forward, this will continue to be the trend, if not accelerating. And in fact, with the farm fish, I just visited one of the local aquaculture farm. You are probably going to see fairly consistent, healthy, big-sized fish on our table because of this approach.
At a reasonable price still?
At an affordable price.
Yes.
Yes.
You wanted to jump in?
Yes, so one of the things that we try to improve every year is looking at all the indicators in the index and trying to get more recent or updated data. And one of the things that we improved this year was we looked at the UN system and the Food and Agriculture Organization, and they had an updated data set on the basket of food goods in each country. So we used this, we collected back data, and what we found is that this, from last year to this year, food increased across these 113 countries by about 5.7%, almost 6%. From the last 5 years, that increase is about 25%. So you can see the trend is about there. But as my other panelists have said, that doesn't necessarily mean better quality, right? So why does food increase? A big driver is conflict. So in the situation in Yemen or Venezuela, you get huge price increases.
Syria is also towards the bottom of your index.
Exactly. Interesting situation in Egypt and Turkey as well, and Argentina, where currency devaluations means that it's harder for them to import food, and that means that products that end up on the shelf are more expensive. So there are a variation of reasons that food increases, and is not necessarily tied to higher quality.
Yeah. Which leaves it for you to wrap up, I guess, two of those points. One is the quality and what more you can do to boost the quality for your farmers. And again, that affordability and the financing question, is there actually a role that you're playing in this regard?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think at the farm level, it's very clear, right? Science and technology in agriculture can actually really help to boost kind of not only the quantity of food that we produce, but the quality of food that our farmers produce. Now, but I think across the food chain, if you think about the digitalization capability, a lot of the inefficiencies that we're seeing right now is because of intransparency in the food chain, right? You have supply of food not linking to where the demand of foods are, and then you also have multiple middlemen between the farmers and the markets. So with digital technology coming in, all of this can be transformed, right? So, Corteva, we are actually looking proactively to work together with food companies, with financial institutions, with chefs, and with AgTech, digital AgTech company, here in Singapore, to actually kind of unlock that. A little bit. Yeah.
Corteva, obviously a global company. Can you give us an international flavor beyond Singapore, beyond Asia?
In terms of the digitalization, I think in other parts of the world, the farming of tomorrow is here today. So in terms of modern farms, big-scale farms, they're able to actually have produce a lot more and better quality output for a lower footprint of the environment and a smaller patch of land. And also, digitalization are actually, kind of transforming transparency in the market are actually available in a lot of the other markets as well. So I think the question becomes, how do we then translate that to this part of the world where we actually have smallholder farmers and also a lot more complexity in the logistics, I guess.
I feel like that's one of the biggest challenges when you're talking about farmers and the growers of food that we've met. These are people who traditionally are in these lines because of either socioeconomic status or they are there because geographically this is what the economy is in the regions that they are in. Coastal fishermen, farming areas are very arid, next to plains that are full of silt, alluvium, good water sources. They will go into farming, right? So these farmers tend not to be as connected, naturally speaking. They're not in big cities. Maybe the younger ones do. But then again, there's another point there of the average age of farmers increasing massively. What was it now at 60?
Above 50 for sure.
Above 50, right?
Yeah.
It's a very
There's
worrying-
hope for all of us after this career. But I guess the point is that younger generation has to come through that will naturally bring the technology with them. I guess that's your point.
Yeah, then if you're more inclined to get on board some of these digital systems using blockchain to reduce the link between me as a grower to the direct seller. For instance, in the mountains of Dieng, Brastagi potatoes, as the slightly more waxy variety that we're accustomed to in Asia. Potatoes you put into stews, curries, they don't break up. They're not fluffy and powdery. Completely different from the type that you use to make mashed potatoes. Now these potatoes are grown by growers and they're sold for much less than you'd expect. And conversely, we buy them from supermarkets in Singapore at prices that these farmers cannot even fathom because of the multiple gaps in between the systems and the gates that this potato has to go through. First distributor brings it down the mountain, second distributor sorts it, third guy has the facilities to pack it in, seal it hermetically, wash them, dry them, cold chain, before putting them into approved boxes that are screened for metal particles, agricultural byproducts, and then move to Singapore before they're cleared. So there's so many gates here. And I'm quite sure that the digitalization is going to assist in some of these processes, definitely.
Once again, please join us in our conversation. We're almost halfway through our live webcast today for the Global Food Security Index launch, developed by the Economist Intelligence Unit and supported by Corteva Agriscience. So once again, don't delay. Go to the comments box and add your questions, comments, or other contributions. In the description part of this video, you'll also find a link to the Global Food Security Index 2019. It is foodsecurityindex.eiu.com. Go to it, play around with the various levers, and see how the place where you are watching us from is impacted by those different changes. And we'll talk about climate change in greater detail. But let's firstly tackle man-made changes. Clearly, conflicts, Venezuela, Syria, we've talked about. But there are other man-made changes. For example, Zimbabwe, which 60% of the population is not getting enough food. I noticed too, and it might just be a statistical blip, but the United Kingdom has also fallen in its ranking, and I wonder, of course, whether that has anything to do with that man-made phenomenon called Brexit. So would you like to reflect on whether there are too many own goals being scored, quite apart from the pricing pressure, the financing pressure, and the land use pressures?
Yeah, I'll leave it to you to decide whether Brexit is an own goal.
I have no idea.
But I think on the aspect of man-made changes, another big driver of food price increase and food availability are agricultural tariffs, right? And we have been in a world that is generally quite open for a lot of trade, and obviously agriculture is one of the most protected sectors. A country like Singapore, for example, very open, has a very diverse source of food imports. I think we get food from 170 different countries. So even though we are very food import dependent, at least we have a very diverse supply chain, which is excellent. But things like conflicts obviously cut the increased physical barriers to trade. The other things that happen are things like trade wars. We are seeing a big one between China and the US, of course. Recently this year, China and Canada had a bit of a tiff, and they sort of banned pork, and then after that, it got. So those
does this show up in the index? Are you seeing an impact of that?
So one of the things is that when it comes to the trade war and Brexit, these things haven't sort of petered out. There's a delayed effect of these types of changes, but generally, if we are going into a world where we'll have more bilateral types of agreements on agricultural tariffs, where sort of open regional economic imperatives kind of break down because of political or geopolitical tensions, then I think we are apt to see prices increase because of that man-made own goal kind of situation.
This must be a very interesting time for you as the Managing Director for ASEAN to see all of these things play out in our region.
Yeah, I think, just to add to Mana's point, I think there's a lot of role that we can play in opening up our policy a little bit to be more open. Just going from food self-sufficiency to food security is a huge difference, isn't it?
Just explain that a little.
So food self-sufficiency means that you have to be self-sufficient. You have to produce everything yourself, and whatever you need to consume. Versus food security, even if you take ASEAN as a whole, manning it together and being more open in terms of the right flow of trades and enabling that with the right policy, actually can, I think, go a long way, right, Sumana, in terms of actually increasing the food security of all of us. So food security means it doesn't really matter where it's made, right, a little bit, but as long as there's actually enough enabling policies, and transparencies and, in the system to make sure that it gets to where it needs to get to.
ASEAN has 10 countries. Have any of them actually benefited from some of these man-made issues such as trade wars?
I'm not, I think, theoretically, yes, because of anytime you see a shift in trade, right, some corner of the world will either benefit or not benefit. But I think as a whole, I'm a firm believer that when you have a free market and open policy, especially where food is concerned, it will be much better for all.
Yes,
I'll strongly echo that because particular country may momentarily benefit from a switch of import source. But in the longer term, anything that creates friction, add friction to the open trading, open economic system is just going to increase costs overall. Yeah. I mean, Singapore is a classic example of not being food self-sufficient. On the other hand, there's no question about the food security. Can we add robustness to it? The answer is yes, and we can talk about that. But this is because we play to each other's advantage, because we are able to work together, we are able to collaborate, we are able to trade. So we don't want to introduce unnecessary friction to the global trading system. Anything that adds friction to it cannot be good for the global community.
What can other countries around the world learn from Singapore in this regard to navigate some of these difficult waters?
I think there are many countries that actually practice similar approaches to Singapore because they benefit from the global open trading system. Many of the smaller countries, many of the exporting countries, they benefit from a similar approach.
Now, Ming Tan is a big fan of Chinese caviar. He's about to reveal the secret as to why, and in particular, whether you've got more of it now that less is going to Donald Trump.
I think we talked about the concerns that various places have with regards to the provenance of food, right? And all it takes is a little bit of activity as well as very targeted capability to build specific capabilities also. So caviar is one of those like rare foods. You think it's very rarefied. You need a certain type of climate. You need a certain space, certain kind of environment, right? And people have this idea that a territory like China, with its fast-growing population and all these horror stories you hear of poor sanitation and hygiene, you can't link the two together. But in fact, China produces some of the world's best caviar at this point because there was a push a number of years ago. This is not something that happened just over the course of 1 or 2 years. You take a lot of time to seed the ground and to make sure it's a pristine environment, to develop the talent and the skill set. I'm not an advocate for these companies, but I mean, it's very impressive for me as a chef to understand that now these markets are opening up and the products that are coming out of places that traditionally don't produce these things are available, and the quality is astounding. It's very phenomenal.
China, as you know, has an unfortunate history of tampering with food. You think of the milk scandals of years gone by. Has that changed on the ground? Are you more comfortable buying in Chinese-grown products into your kitchens?
I think one of the things that we realized in recent years is the growth of the Chinese market has come a lot from the youth as a product of, say, their families and their family units becoming more and more affluent, right?
Yes.
And because some of their basic needs are now covered, they can look at things like sourcing, tracing, right, labeling, and they see a lot of bad press go out about the state of food security and hygiene in their country, and they react to this as well. So I can't speak on their behalf, but I do know that food sourcing and labeling is a massive growing thing that's coming out of not just China, but a lot of Asia also. And it's starting with the youth, right? They care about things like food miles, provenance, impact, footprints. These are all key words that maybe 10 years ago, only a very specific subset of people would bother talking about. But increasingly now, these are in the mainstream sort of consciousness of is my food, do I know all the information about the food I'm putting into my mouth, essentially.
So Anna, you looked at labeling in the index.
Yes. One thing that Ming mentioned was provenance, and what that threw up, in the context of man-made impediments, let's say, is I think there are two other things. One is intellectual property and copyrights. As we move into food tech and ag tech, there is a balance between the ability to innovate, profitably, and also share the spoils of that innovation. And the other thing also about provenance is data, right? So increasingly, the ability to share data across borders is going to be very important for the consumers, for the youth, but for consumers overall. And we don't want to be able to block that unnecessarily.
But labeling, coming back to that point, is actually a surprising issue in many countries, isn't it? The index found that in some countries, it might be common for you to go to the supermarket and check the back of the can or whatever it is in order to see what the nutritional information is. But that's not a universal privilege, is it?
It's not. And nutrition guidelines are very, very important. So we looked at two different things to give you some of the context behind nutrition. One is we updated our indicator for nutrition plans and strategies in countries. And what we did in that update was previously we only looked at nutrition plans for adults. But this year we looked at nutrition plans for adults and children. Because obviously their dietary needs are very different. And any kind of deficiencies, especially in children or the youth, can lead to cognitive deficiencies that go a long way. And so labeling guidelines are very important to be able to signal that. And the other one is creating consumer awareness. One of the things we found, which perhaps not that surprising, quite intuitive, was that if you have a national, say, nutrition strategy that you want to get out to your population, it's not sufficient to just put that down on a piece of paper in the form of words. A simple thing like having an infographic or creating some kind of local context so that it's not just something very generic really increases the awareness amongst consumers. So nutrition strategies are very important, but they need to be catered to different sectors of the population, and also that communication aspect is very, very important.
Yes, because often sometimes even as you would think a fairly sophisticated consumer, you look at the nutritional information, it looks like a lab report. You don't really know what to do with it, right, Mr. Lim?
Yes. So just to join the conversation, including going back to what happened in China, in 40 years since they opened up, the per capita GDP has grown by 60 times. Yeah. It is the fastest growing middle class in the world. and they are really determining the future of choices, especially when it comes to food. They will not just go for any food. In fact, they are a lot more discerning now. And because of this, there will be pressure for the farmers to produce quality food. Yeah. There will be pressure for the labeling to be accurate. If you saw what happened in one of their crisis episodes just a few years ago, the Chinese mothers started buying the milk powder from other countries because they trusted those products.
Like New Zealand, they had a shortage there in the end.
And this is going to continue to add pressure for the enterprises to respond to the needs. I was just in China last year for an industry visit, and we went to not the coastal area, which is very advanced, but to Xi'an. And we wanted to have local food, went to a local Xi'an restaurant. And guess what I saw at the window? It wasn't display of menu and so on. It was indoor urban farming. When you order your plate of vegetable, the waitress rushed to this thing, opened up, took a tray, and then brought it to the kitchen. I mean, this is literally like zero food miles. Where there's a demand, especially coming from your affordable middle class that is now shaping the taste, the market will respond. And I think China will set the trend.
Mm-hmm. Anything on labeling before I invite?
So this is now translated into demand because of this middle class, and soon it will be Indian population because their economy is also growing very fast, and likewise the Southeast Asian population.
Right. Farah, again, wrap that up for us because you've heard a number of these points, origin, intellectual property, labeling. What are some of the cutting edge things that we can expect as both sophisticated consumers as well as the end customer?
Yeah, I think picking up what Ming and Mr. Lim just mentioned, I think with the increasing middle income and population growth, there's going to be increasing expectation of quality, right, of food. So not only quantity but quality of food. So I think this whole entire traceability and from the farm all the way to the table will become increasingly important. And there's actually technology all across. Yeah, so at the farm level, tagging technology, so that people are able to not only identify the origin, but what was used on that farm, right? Traceability of residues, once the produce leaves the farm, yeah? And then as they get transported, the freshness get traced, the packaging, quality basically get traced, and then getting to the table. So I think a lot of that actually then boils down to it requires collaboration. Food security requires collaboration, not only at the start at the farm level, but actually across the food chain. Because we're not really only talking about the quantity of food anymore. Now, going to the future, feeding the growing population and middle income, we're talking about the quality of food as well.
But how do you keep track, particularly when you work with so many smallholders, so many farmers? It must be very difficult to maintain a standard that consumers can rely on.
Yeah, it has to be. I mean, it has to be based on science and technology and something that is actually easy to implement and to actually aggregate. Yeah, and it has to be enabled by digitalization. Mm-hmm. Right, so.
And that other point about intellectual property. Clearly, Corteva needs to be able to reinvest in its business, but to what extent is there scope to, as you so eloquently put it, to share the spoils, as it were?
I think in terms of intellectual we are not really having so much issue when we're talking about at the farm level. I think that's more of an issue and an industry player to industry player, right? Especially when we're talking about smallholder farmers, enabling them and sharing technology at that level does not actually risk IP,
Yeah. So. What I was talking is about intellectual property protection at the national level, right? So what your frameworks are, the ability, say, ASEAN-wide to go into a market and be able to produce there because you're protected by good laws and good regulatory frameworks. Things very, very important for the advent of food tech and the advent of ag tech.
Yeah.
Let's wrap up on nutrition with one particular findings about vitamin A. Could you just reflect on what some of the and zinc, I believe, is the other mineral that's sorely lacking in many people's diets? What did you find?
Yes, so this was an issue before, and across the world there is deficiency in vitamin A, which is very important for many different health outcomes, and also zinc. And the reason for that is, what we said at the beginning, right, is that we have seen very high caloric intake, and that has been increasing, and that hasn't been so much of an issue. But the diversity of people's diets, that becomes an issue. When, say, there are more middle-income consumers and they get more affluent and they eat more protein, it doesn't necessarily mean that you're getting all the different types of proteins you need, right? There are 9 different types of amino acids, and if you only eat meat, you don't get all of them, right? So I think that this variety of and your dietary diversity is very important when you're looking at the overall nutrition of the population. And that's why I also mentioned about monitoring. Right? Nutrition monitoring has actually gone down. From last year to this year, there was a decrease of about 3% in terms of nutrition monitoring. That doesn't seem like a lot, but not for companies, for governments at the national level to be able to implement interventions when it comes to vitamin A deficiencies or zinc deficiencies, they need to be able to figure out what's going on in the population.
Is there a role for Impossible and Beyond and some of these manufactured meats or a variety of ways to produce food to step in where some of these deficiencies arise?
Well, I'll let Ming comment on Impossible because he knows that better.
I think one of the hardest questions to crack is how do you provide easily accessible, in terms of price and location, food that is both nutritionally sound and tasty at the same time. You have this triangle of fast, cheap, and good. You can't have all of them at the same time, right?
Yes.
And traditionally, food and food systems have struggled with the idea of providing high nutrition together with low cost. It's not that it's not doable. It's just that there are so many available products that help to add to your caloric bulk that are low value in terms of nutritional content. So you're talking about things like refined sugars, refined carbohydrates, and calories that come from fats. Sometimes palm oil gets a bad rep for this, but if you look at a lot of the readily available foods that are shelf stable especially, and this is an issue here because in a lot of rural places, or not even rural, just off core from major cities where the bulk of the populations of poverty are located, like not in the cities, but just outside of the cities, right? They pay sort of city prices and they can't afford it. These are the places that don't often have like full-on access to like supply chains. You want things that are easily stored and stored for a long time because then you don't have to deal with the additional cost of refrigeration. So deficiencies in vitamins often come from you're not eating enough of X. Scurvy was always an issue because you couldn't keep certain things fresh on boats for month-long journeys, right? And in the same way, I'm not saying we're all on boats now, but in the same way, if you don't get enough access to high-quality proteins and specific fresh vegetables, right, you will have these issues. And it's a very, very tough nut to crack. There are big markets that are calling out for these solutions. I do believe that being able to find alternative sources of nutrition, not just proteins, but nutrition in general. For example, you mentioned companies like Impossible Foods, Beyond Meats. I think another company that is doing very well in this is called Corn. They've actually been around for decades, since the 70s, I believe, with their own mycoprotein products, right? And they've used this as a form of alternative meats for fish and chicken very, very, very successfully. So if you can find ways to turn those products into something that is easily delivered, I think you'll be able to crack that problem.
Good, and let's wrap up on that because it's only 2 generations ago since Singapore faced some of these malnutrition issues. How do you see this play out with some of these additional foods coming into the market?
So I think the affordability obviously is the first step of the solution, but clearly it's not enough because very often you find they move from one problem to another problem. They move from not having enough calorific value to then having a wrong set of diet that lead to diabetes or obesity. So education is very important. Creating a guideline is very important. And this is where I think the advent of the digital revolution, the very convenient app, really can help the consumer today in being able to monitor what they have consumed, in being able to be advised at a point in which you consume what nutritional value that you're actually getting. You just imagine your daily activity tracker on your mobile phone.
Yes.
You easily can have a function of your nutritional tracker, and all you need is just to take a picture of what you're eating. There will be a back-end matching to give you a sense as to how much you're consuming. So these are good direction of travel, and I think it is proliferated right now. Obviously, one of them will emerge as the killer app, and then most people will adopt that approach. But right now, there are many of these apps available.
Yes. Okay, so as we head into the last 10 minutes of our live webcast, it's your final opportunity to get your questions or comments heard and answered by our panelists from the Economist Intelligence Unit, Corteva Agriscience, and the Singapore Food Agency, along with Ming Tan, who is restaurateur extraordinaire. Let's focus away from some of the man-made issues that we've talked about so far, and the one, I guess, the full stop issue, and that is climate change. Tell us firstly what the index found, the Global Food Security Index found about the impact of climate change, especially because when you go to the website, you can actually apply some of those climate change metrics, and actually the rankings really change, don't they?
Exactly. I think that's one of the most interesting features of the website and the research that we do, is that we have those three categories, but we've also added a category of natural resources and resilience. So actually it's a mix of man-made and climate type factors. And when you apply that that fourth category, you see how the rankings change. One of the big changes is Singapore. So obviously being a small state surrounded by different types of risks, like ocean eutrophication, that type of climate factor. That's one of the reasons that Singapore falls a number of places. But also Singapore is very dependent on food imports. But we see it throughout the index. The other country in Southeast Asia that falls a lot is the Philippines. That's because it's exposed to a lot of different climate factors as well.
Like the typhoon just last week.
Like the typhoon, yeah. And not only last week, Typhoon Hainan wiped out about $600 million worth of farmland. And that had impacts all the way down the supply chain.
And El Nino earlier this year as well.
Exactly.
Yes,
So constant issues. And I think that, we had to make a decision about how we wanted to encompass these factors into the index, and we decided to leave those three categories alone because those are very good for policy type benchmarking. But when you add these climate factors and the natural resource factors, that also gives you an indication. The other one, of course, is population stress. So how fast you are urbanizing, how fast your population is growing, and in some cities, in the Japans of the world, that's actually a positive factor, right? So it's a very interesting way of looking at these different outcomes of food security.
In fact, Singapore falls from top position to number 11 once you apply the climate change factors.
So this is a very timely reminder. In fact, I think the Singapore government is looking at this issue, which is why, last year, the Singapore government declared food as an existential issue, and this is why the agency was created to focus building on food safety, now paying attention in a much deeper way to food security. The earlier on I mentioned the diversification or import strategy has worked for Singapore, but I think we can do better. We can add robustness to this by leveraging on the leaps and bounds growth in technology to really increase local production, so that this strategy that we have for food security will be a lot more robust. I think in the past it's really very challenging because the technology could not afford us that kind of a meaningful supply of food. But today with Industry 4.0 and our understanding of how plants can grow in an indoor environment already provide one source with very minimal surface area footprint, you actually can produce 15, 20 times more food compared to open farming. The other direction that I think is very exciting, and fortunately Singapore has invested in many of these areas of research, albeit applied to other areas, but now repurposed for food production in the space of alternative protein. stem cell biology, bioprocessing, and then going to scale it up. These are things that we have the resources, we have the wherewithal, we have the people that know how to do this. And of course, we want to remain open as a location so that other entrepreneurs, other scientific entrepreneurs from around the world would like to use Singapore as a launch location for this area of food innovation. So we believe that through this approach, through leveraging on science and technology, maybe in about 10 years, we can produce perhaps up to 30% of our nutritional needs in Singapore.
And that's in fact your target, isn't it?
It is.
30 by
Yeah.
30.
30 by 30.
30 by 30.
Yeah.
Yes.
And hopefully you won't fall down to 11 if you apply the climate change stats. Farah, this is of course a huge issue for you. Tell us, what are you seeing on the ground in terms of the impacts of climate change?
Great. Yeah. So, as I mentioned earlier, it's actually an increasing challenge. So our farmers are actually facing increasing water constraint, increasing climate, dynamic, extreme climate dynamic. So I think, connected to what Mr. Lim has mentioned, I think the science and technology of agriculture science and technology plays a significant role to actually break that food versus environment trade-off, right? So I'll give you an example. 90% of rice is actually grown here in Asia. And also consumed in Asia as well, right? It's near dear to our hearts, rice. So a lot of the rice grown actually are using the transplanted rice method, which is a very highly intensive, water-intensive method to use.
Mm-hmm. That's where we see the paddy fields and the back.
Exactly, when you see, exactly, and labor-intensive as well. Now, in India, Corteva is working with farmers to help them to transition from transplanted rice to direct seeded rice. That actually then requires less water, right? So just to give an idea, if you produce rice with transplanted method, it uses 3,000 to 5,000 liters for every kg of rice you produce.
That's a lot of water, isn't it?
Exactly. So, to put in perspective, a household of 4, only 1,000 liter per day to actually do everything that we do, drink, cook, wash, everything. So every time you eat 1 kg of rice, you're actually consuming 3 to 5x of your daily household water consumption. So when farmers can successfully move from transplanted rice to direct seeded rice, right, and maintain their yield and their quality by using latest hybrid rice technology, latest weed control technology, latest mechanization technology, they can actually reduce their water consumption by 30 to 50%, and they can actually save labor, right? So this is and there are many, many examples such as this where advancement in science and technology can actually break that environment versus food trade-off. These are very real, right?
But you must also be concerned about your smallholder farmers, right? How much of their land is at risk of climate change, simply that they won't be your smallholder farmers into the future?
Yeah, I think there as well, there's going to be, I think, 2 movements that we're going to see. One is basically, like if you look at Vietnam Mekong Delta with increasing salinity in the water there. There is actually going to be advancement in seed technology where we are going to actually be, having seed that are actually more resilient to saline water. Okay, so there's that. There's also an opportunity to actually then again apply a little bit of agronomic science to check if there are other more suitable crops, that can be actually grown, in those areas. So I think that the challenge is real, and I think the answer really needs to be rooted on science, right, and it kind of enabling the farmers, at the ground level.
And as far as said, water security, very, very important issue. And what we found in the index is that you look at all of the countries, there's not enough access to easily irrigated land. It's one of the big issues, and that can be solved at the national level, but it's also often an interstate type issue as well. But the other thing, I know you mentioned technology. It's very, very important for farmers, but when it comes to climate change, insurance is becoming very, very important.
Absolutely.
And I think that
Will they insure?
intersection between catastrophic risk and the ability to monitor for that in different ways and issue payouts much faster, I think you might know a bit about that, is a trend that we are seeing that's emerging.
So agriculture insurance, farmers insurance, something that we can actually work together with financial institutions, right? To actually enable that. Right now, what's really the missing link there is data, basically, because there's no data transparency of these farmers. It's very difficult to actually then go and insure them. But we are working on that. People are working on that, cross companies, cross industries, to help.
So far, what you've mentioned, for example, rice farmers in India using much less water by planting rice differently, doesn't sound like a revolutionary change, but obviously has a revolutionary impact, you could say. Are there any other such climate positive innovations where you would say that actually here is something that is totally groundbreaking and out of this world?
Yeah, I think something like that may not sound revolutionary, but actually the science behind it is quite revolutionary, because if you think about it, there's a huge amount of science and technology discovery on the seed, engineering itself, to be able to actually withstand and produce more yield even under stress and duress, dry condition and drought condition. Mm-hmm. So actually, there is actually a lot of science that actually needs to go to be able to,
And it's a conversation that we'd like to continue, obviously, here with you in the comments box underneath this video. We are almost at the end of our webcast. Just some final comments on the Global Food Security Index, some of the findings, and where are you going to use it? How are you going to supply it? Ming Tan.
I think it's perhaps slightly abstract to provide information like this to our consumers in the form of patrons and guests. But as chefs, I think definitely we can take the information within and understand that there's so many things that connect us to our food systems, and the information is all there for you to go and figure out and find out. But there are innovative ways in which you can find new products. You can not let climate change be an issue for you, especially for sourcing, and as well as price also. That's something that can change.
Mm-hmm. Mr. Lim?
I think this is a very important index. Obviously, it is not the basis for policy formulation, but it is very important to inform and a mirror to check on the policy and the implementation. So, for instance, the fourth category about the national resources and resilience, this is an issue that Singapore is grappling with, but through the index effort, there's a greater survey of the situation around the world that help inform our decision and perhaps sharpen our strategy. So we continue to want to leverage on the data from the Global Food Security Index so that we can fine-tune our strategy.
Yes. Now, Corteva Agriscience supported the development. Farah, how are you actually using the Global Food Security Index?
I think we're using the Global Food Security Index in a lot of the conversations that we're actually having, especially when we go and actually we invest in a country. We become part of that country, and we are part of the success of the agriculture industry in that country and the success of the food security of that country. And I think the Food Security Index is nice because it's a neutral kind of platform where we can actually say, okay, where are the areas that we can actually work together? Where are the areas where we, Corteva, can actually support the agenda for agricultural growth, as well as farmers' welfare, rural community welfare, and finally food security for the countries that we're in.
Gives you the final word.
Well, I would like to say that food security is a complex system, and any solution needs a view of this kind of complexity. Mm-hmm. And so whether you're the restaurateur, or the agency, or the big company, or the smallholder farmer, or the consumer, it's all of those interrelated dynamics that are needed when you're seeking solutions.
We've come to the end of our live webcast. Thank you very much for joining us, and my thanks to Ming Tan, celebrity chef, Lim Chuan Po from the Singapore Food Agency. We've also had with us Farah Siriga, ASEAN Managing Director of Corteva Agriscience, and Sumana Rajaratnam from the Economist Intelligence Unit. So make sure that you now go and check out the index for yourself. Once again, you will find it at the bottom of this video. Look in the descriptions box. You'll find the link there, foodsecurityindex.eiu.com. Let's keep the conversation going. I'm Mark Lowdy. Have a great rest of the day ahead.